This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In the early weeks and months of the COVID-19 pandemic, few things were as politically fraught as the decision to close some schools and attempt remote learning. Today, millions of students are still struggling academically and emotionally, and absenteeism rates in many districts have hit record levels. Today's guest is Apoorva Mandavilli, science and global health reporter for the New York Times. She looked closely at one aspect of this controversy, how air quality in public schools factors into student learning, and what's keeping more policymakers from heeding some of the pandemic's potentially crucial lessons. Apoorva Mandavilli, welcome to EWA Radio.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about some of these takeaways from your piece. Separate from controlling air quality as a response to a pandemic, why does this matter for student learning all the time?
It's important for so many reasons. We started talking about it during the pandemic, but good air quality is important for academic performance. It's important for memory. It's important for focus. And actually, it can affect test scores. There are studies showing that when there's poor air quality in a classroom, scores from tests actually drop for students. So it's important for many, many things. And of course, the most obvious sort of health problems too. It has big impacts for asthma and respiratory diseases of other kinds. And it can also increase disparities, health disparities, because the poorest schools are often the ones with the worst air quality.
Well, it's interesting because your story makes clear that students from a lot of these underserved communities are actually being hit with a double whammy. They're not only more likely to come into a classroom with poor air quality, but they may be coming from a background or experience or may already have asthma that makes them more vulnerable to that bad air.
That's right. And, the oldest schools and the poorest schools have the worst sort of infrastructure. They have the least wherewithal to even take care of air quality because they have the fewest staff. They have the least money to attend to these things. They have lots of other problems that they need to worry about along the way. And often these buildings are really close to highways and industries. And so they are really coping with terrible air quality to begin with. And they can't do something as simple as open a window.
This is a challenge for the students, of course, but it's also for faculty and staff. Tell us about that.
Well, schools these days have to think about lots and lots of things, right? You mentioned learning loss at the very outset. And I think that's a huge thing that all schools are having to cope with at the end of the pandemic now. We're really looking at all the ways in which students must be helped with their mental health, with education. There are a lot of schools that are grappling with gun safety. In my story, I talked about one school in particular, East High in Denver, that had 3 incidents of gun safety, gun violence in their academic year last year, and really serious issues. And so they can't do something as simple as open their windows, but they also don't have the time or energy to be thinking about air quality when they've got these much more pressing issues.
You looked, as you mentioned, at East High in the Denver area, but then you went not so far away to Boulder, and it was a different story, wasn't it?
It really is. And I think that illustrates the equity issue that I was talking about earlier, which is where you go to school has such an impact on what your air quality looks like in the classroom. Because Boulder, even though it's really close to Denver, those schools were thinking about air quality well before the pandemic. They had actually passed a bond to improve air quality in their school districts years before the pandemic. The high school that I went to, Boulder High, had air quality monitors in every room. It's all connected to this central network where they can monitor how the air quality is in a classroom. And if a particular classroom is doing poorly, for example, they can say, oh, there are too many kids in this classroom. It's a very sophisticated sort of setup. And they can do that because it's a relatively wealthy school district, but also because they had help from the University of Colorado, their air quality experts who were advising them from the beginning. And so they knew that this issue is important.
What I think might surprise some people is that there's these vast differences between schools in the same state. So, you might expect, of course, there'd be different expectations for how clean the school's air has to be between Colorado and Missouri or Florida and Connecticut. But we're talking about schools within the same state. What was your sense about where the rules are coming from deciding how clean the air has to be?
A lot of the decisions get made at the district level. So whether a particular school has good air quality or not might come down to whether the school district has prioritized it. Some of what I saw at East High, for example, is because of East High, but some of it is also because of the Denver School District. And in this case, actually, the Denver School District had spent quite a bit of money trying to improve air quality. But one of the things that they came up against, which is true for a lot of school districts across the country, is that the buildings in Denver, the school buildings, are incredibly old. I mean, East High is 100 years old. And it's not the kind of school and not the kind of building that you can really easily modernize and put in, an HVAC system, a heating, ventilation, air conditioning system that can handle pollution, that can handle pathogens, that can handle all the issues that it would need to handle. And so much of that has to do with what other issues that the district is facing. And in some cases, there are also states that made some decisions about where the money should go and set priorities for their school districts. And so that also plays into it. Politics, as you can imagine, especially because this was an issue related to the pandemic, has had some impact.
Where does the federal rules fit into this? 'Cause certainly, as you've said, it's been put aside. There's plenty of blame to go around on decisions that were made to stay open or to close. But where does the federal rules on air quality for schools? What do we know?
So there's two issues there, right? There's federal money, and there's tons of that. There's more money now than there ever has been. There's $200 billion that the federal government set aside, a lot of which could go to things like air quality. But a lot of that, again, has come down to priorities for schools. And so some of that hasn't been used, and we can certainly talk more about that. But if you're talking about rules, what do federal rules say about air quality? There really aren't any. And I think that's been a big part of the problem. There is no ventilation czar. There is no ventilation agency. None of the organizations that you'd expect, like EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, they don't really talk about indoor air quality. And so that's why we don't really have any rules and regulations really regarding air quality. And every school district, every business, every family has to sort of figure this out for themselves. Now, finally, we do have some guidance from organizations like ASHRAE, which is a professional organization of people who work in this field. And the CDC also released some information, some very specific information on what schools should be thinking about. But until really recently, this all happened this year in May and June. Until then, there was very little information on what we should be thinking about for air quality.
As you've said, this is clearly an equity issue when it comes to how clean the air is inside these schools. You've mentioned some of the challenges for urban communities, for example, ones that may be situated next to a busy road or not have a lot of outdoor space where they could send students outdoors in good weather to learn. Some of those things are simply beyond the school's control. But where did you find that this is an issue about those priorities that you mentioned, where there could be a possibility of making the air cleaner if there was the will?
Well, so East High, for example, the principal told me that even at the height of the pandemic, she had to worry about all these other things, right? She had to worry about the violence issues at their school. She had to worry about the kids' mental health. She had to worry about making sure that the kids had enough laptops and all the other things that they needed to get their learning on track. And those schools often have very few resources available to them. They don't have necessarily experts helping them with everything. They don't have the kind of staff that they would need to put in the improvements or to maintain them once they're made. They don't know exactly what to do, how to even go about doing some of these things. And often the schools that are in the poorest districts, the poorest schools, don't have the parent population that can be pushy about some of these things. A lot happens because of PTA associations that really push for certain kinds of improvements. And if the parents are also busy working multiple jobs and don't necessarily have the wherewithal to demand these changes, that's also not going to happen.
You looked at a Friends Quaker school, a small private campus, just 120 students, but it was right in the backyard of Penn State University. And you make it clear that this is obviously a very specialized school and a special example, but you also found that there are lessons there that could be scaled up. What are they?
So this is a very special school. I mean, it's a small school, but one of the things that I saw there is that every single classroom opened to the outside. Now, because I said a lot of school buildings are old, that may not be a possibility. But they also had things like air filters, which don't have to cost a lot of money. They had a couple of air filters per room, or they had three if the room was really big. And those air filters are not necessarily all that expensive. They can be as little as $100 or $200. And if the school thought about it as a per student cost, it doesn't have to be very much. There are schools that even used what they call a Corsi Rosenthal box, which anybody can actually put together with a little bit of help and a little bit of mechanical know-how. And those are really inexpensive. So what I really saw at Friends ultimately is an attention to air quality. They actually thought about it and they came up with policies that made it very easy for them to take care of their student population and to take care of their staff. The thing that they did, I think, is also that they really thought about mask use and they were very committed to making sure that even if when air quality was bad, that their families were protected, their students were protected. So it's a very unusual school, but the takeaway for me is that they really cared about these issues and they thought about what they could do.
As a health reporter, I'm interested in what you found specifically for COVID-19 about the impact of cleaner school air on transmission rates, as well as whether schools were able to stay open or closed.
So the evidence on this is a bit garbled because there weren't a lot of really good studies being done at the height of the pandemic. But the few studies that we have show that there is a definite impact of ventilation on whether schools saw a lot of outbreaks or not. So the CDC did one particular study which showed that when schools had improvements to air quality, they had something like 40% fewer COVID cases. There was another study from Italy that showed something like 80% difference when they had schools that really improved their ventilation systems. And schools that did both, did air quality and did masking was even better. So it really does show that when you pay attention to this, it can make a real difference.
As a health reporter, sort of a mini parachute, I would say, not a full parachute, because certainly you're well versed in the core issue at stake here, which is about air quality. But coming onto the education beat, what were some of the roadblocks you hit here?
I've been writing about COVID in school since the beginning of the pandemic, so that parachute landed a little while ago, but I'm still really learning how to navigate this landscape. And for me, one of the really difficult things about doing this story is that the bad schools, if you will, the schools that are not doing anything or are doing a bad job or don't care about air quality, don't want you to come visit. So there were a lot of schools that I reached out to that I thought were interesting because they just did not talk about COVID. They did not talk about air quality. They just did not seem to really care about this as an issue, but they also didn't want me to come and visit. And so that was a big difficulty in actually doing the reporting. And one way that I kind of tried to get around that is by working through experts that I knew were working with schools on trying to improve things. So schools that were starting out with sort of bad air quality and then trying to get better. And so that it still gave me some sense of what a school with poor air quality looks like and how it functions and what needs improving.
We're talking with Apoorva Mandavilli of the New York Times about her reporting on air quality, its impact on student learning, and how to keep more schools open amid a global pandemic. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you very much to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Apoorva, I'd like to hear a little bit more about you and your path into journalism. So you grew up in southern India and you came to the U.S. for college at age 17, is that right?
That's right.
Did you always want to be a reporter?
No, I was actually very much set on being a scientist. I was good at science, and in India, especially when I was growing up there, if you were good at science, you became a scientist. It was just a sort of clear path. And so I studied chemistry in college, and I went to graduate school for biochemistry. I thought that's what I would do until I actually started doing lab work. And, at the end of year 3 in graduate school, I decided this is not how I want to spend the rest of my life at a lab bench, hardly talking to people. I'm way too social for that. And I'm also way too curious for that. I got into science because I love science and like lots of different kinds of science. But in grad school, all I was doing was working on cholesterol transport, and that was it. And so I was bored to death and I really needed something broader. And then I discovered that science journalism is a thing. So that's when I made the switch and went to a program at NYU that is specifically for science journalism.
I honestly believe that one of the key overlapping factors that make a great scientist and also a great journalist is the same motivator, and that's curiosity.
I agree. I think people get into this for very similar reasons. They are interested to learn, they want to know, they have questions. And really, from my perspective, I mean, what better job to have for somebody like me who is curious? I get to ask questions of like some of the smartest people in the world, and I'm allowed to. I can ask them anything I want. And it's wonderful that I get to learn about all kinds of new things. As you mentioned, I hadn't really written about education very much. And now I know a lot more about the state of American schools than I used to.
What's been the response to your story?
It's been mostly positive. I would say actually pretty much all positive. A lot of experts are really happy that air quality is getting the attention that it deserves. We've done, this isn't the only story that the Times has done. We've done a series of them, and they've been really happy to see this issue get any attention at all. I've heard from a lot of people with all kinds of inventions that they believe will make a difference to air quality. I'm not really qualified to assess them or to help them bring them to the market or whatever they want me to do, but I am encouraged to see that a lot of people are working on things like this. And then I've heard from a lot of schools that are parents or teachers at different schools that are disheartened by how little is being done at their school, or, really horrific problems that they've had and the lack of will that they're seeing around them.
A lot of your story feels like common sense. Children can't breathe and they're not going to learn. And obviously, if they're sick with things like asthma and missing seat time, they're not going to learn. But there are also some familiar themes to folks who have been on the education beat for a long time. That is, school facilities often get short shrift. There's been a lot of coverage in the last few years, even going back to the recession, almost 15 years ago now, looking back to school facilities just falling behind on basic maintenance. And as you talked about these older school buildings, what is your sense about why this is such a tough nut to crack when there seems to be so much solid research about how crucial air quality is?
Really beats me. I mean,
Apoorva, you're supposed to solve it for us. Oh, man.
I mean, this is the kind of thing I would hope that education reporters would tell me, right? Because I was really baffled during the pandemic why we seem to be going around in circles arguing about whether to keep schools open or closed, and keeping restaurants and churches open, but not about how to keep schools open. That we could keep schools open if we worried about things like air quality, or if we closed the restaurants and churches. It was like this weird, artificial, polarized conversation. And maybe it's because most of us don't really spend our days in school. I mean, we have kids, I have kids, but out of sight, out of mind. We don't really think about what their environment looks like all day long. And really, if we had all the previous winters when kids were getting sick all the time and they had flus and colds, and we knew that they're like little germ factories, we would have still done something about this issue long before COVID.
You definitely avoid the politics of school closures in this piece. That is, whether it was the right or wrong decision. Can you talk about how you approach that framing?
I think that's sort of moot at this point, right? We can look back and discuss that endlessly. And certainly I've been in the middle of a lot of those debates. But at this point, the issue is not whether schools should have been open or closed. Again, like I was just saying, it's really about how we can keep schools open and what schools really need to keep students happy and healthy. And that's to pay attention to air quality. So it doesn't matter whether the politics dictates that the school should stay open or closed, or whether the school should mask or not. It's really about air quality matters. And so let's think about this and what needs to happen for that to be the case, for air quality to be improved.
For the many journalists who are listening to this podcast and those who want to follow your lead on this reporting, where do they start?
Well, so there are federal websites, for example, the Department of Education, that tracks what kind of money went to different states. And a lot of states have more detailed breakdowns of what school districts are doing. The districts had to sort of set up plans for how they would spend their money. And so some of that information is available. And there are a lot of nonprofits that track these things. And then if you are in a particular school district, you're a local reporter, I would start with the school district itself and the schools and whether they're doing anything. I mean, often when schools do something about air quality, they're pretty vocal about it. They advertise it. They're happy and they're proud and they want to talk about it.
I also think looking at what's expected from the state in terms of air quality. So how many schools are going above and beyond the very minimum and using the kind of air quality monitors that you describe versus just sort of, skirting close to the letter of the law?
The problem, I think, is that we don't actually know what air quality is like in most schools, because to begin with, you need monitors. You need to go in and put air quality monitors to even know whether the quality is poor. I mean, it's probably a good bet that a lot of them are. The classrooms are really poorly ventilated, but without knowing how bad the problem is, you can't really solve it. And maybe there are some schools that don't actually need to do very much at all because they did put in an HVAC at some point. But all of these things begin with actually having a conversation. And there are a lot of states where that conversation has not happened yet, but there are many that have begun to think about it. There are a lot of states that are proposing legislation on air quality. And so there is some conversation around this. I don't want to make it such a bleak picture.
Can a reporter figure out what the hallmarks are of a school that's more likely to have the good air quality and where to look for some red flags? Certainly you want to press those schools, which, as you said, are the ones who may be less likely to talk to a reporter when somebody shows up, but are probably the ones that need the spotlight.
Right. So, I found in my reporting that there are schools that not just don't talk about it, but talk about all the other things they're going to do with the money. So they talk about, we're going to use the money to open a gymnasium. We're going to use the money for XYZ, but never talk about COVID and never talk about air quality or ventilation. And those are definitely red flags. I think schools that are really old, that probably cannot and do not have modern ventilation systems, I think that's definitely a big red flag. Even if they want to do something about it, it might be very difficult for them to. And then a school that is likely to have good quality, that's mostly a very active parent population, relatively wealthier school districts, good school buildings. And like I said, they always like to advertise what they're doing.
Another thing that you could do is you could check with the school nurses for your district and ask them to fill out a simple survey of how many students they see in a month with acute asthma or who need to use their inhaler during class, because a lot of schools track that.
That's a great idea. And, already this school season, we've seen some schools close because they had influenza sort of go through their entire classroom or some kind of respiratory bug go through their classroom. And I think those are also red flags that maybe the school doesn't have a good ventilation system.
Apoorva, when I was looking at your background, I found a lot of details on your bio page on the New York Times website. I have to say it was a lot more thorough than some other reporters I've seen. Certainly that's not a criticism. I'm wondering, was that your personal choice? You include details not just about yourself, but on the kind of journalism you practice, which I would describe as no surprises, but also a section on your journalistic ethics.
That is a new format that the New York Times is introducing. And I don't know how many reporters have changed their bios already, but it wasn't my choice. I was approached by our internal team that is working on this project. And they asked me to rewrite my previous bio, which was written much more in a sort of third person, the usual format that you see. And then they wanted it to be this more personal approach, which talks about how I do the work and not just who I am in very dry terms.
I have to say I found it really effective, especially given that you're a health reporter in such a politicized time.
That's great. I think that's great news. I'm going to tell them that.
But I will say, it was, I thought, very thorough and very candid and came across as very even-handed.
I'm really glad to hear that. Thank you.
You've been a health reporter for a long time. We've talked about you've been covering schools since the start of the pandemic. Has anything surprised you from your forays into the education beat?
Maybe this shouldn't have surprised me, but I was a little taken aback by the vitriol. Of course, when it comes to kids, everybody has very strong, passionate feelings. But I have to say that the conversations about school closures and whether kids were at risk from the virus or not, they were some of the ugliest I experienced during the pandemic. And believe me, I was in a lot of ugly conversations, but school-related ones were definitely up there in terms of the nastiness that they could bring out in people. And I was really shocked by that.
Can you tell us anything about what you're working on next, what we can look forward to?
Well, I'm starting to write about COVID again because COVID is a thing again. The virus was quiet for a little bit, but it's coming back. And there's a lot to be looked into in terms of the variants that are coming up, what we might expect this fall and winter, the new vaccines that are likely to be approved next week. So there's a lot going on with COVID. And I'm an infectious disease reporter, so I'm also keeping my eye on other viruses and trying to spend some time paying attention to things that I really neglected during the pandemic, like HIV and malaria and TB and polio and all the other things that we should be worrying about.
Apoorva Mandavilli is a science and global health reporter at the New York Times and joined us from her office. Apoorva, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks very much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For 76 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.